In the name of the living God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Y'all, greetings from the dog days of summer. We're in mid to late July, and here we are with our next installment of David Bentley Hart, Coffee Stains and All, The Experience of God, Being, Consciousness, and Bliss. And today we are going to go over chapter 4, I believe, entitled Consciousness, or Chit, C-H-I-T. You'll remember that the subtitle of this book is Being, Consciousness, and Bliss. And so that word consciousness is the subject of this next chapter that we're going to be looking at today. And you'll also remember that in Sanskrit, or the language that many Indian languages that we tend to group under the label of Hinduism, who speak in the and think in the Sanskrit language, they have this compound word Sat Chit Ananda, and you'll remember that Sat means being, Chit means consciousness, and Ananda means bliss. And you might remember that there was a Jesuit missionary in India in the early 20th century who literally translated the phrase Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as Sat Chit Ananda, which I think makes brilliant sense. And so today we come to chapter 4 on consciousness / chit. And what I wanted to do, I sort of had 4 bullet points, and yeah, let's get started. So our last discussion, we talked about being. This was chapter 3, being, or Sat. And you'll remember that a lot of what David Bentley Hart's trying to do in this book is to get us to think about the meaning of the word God in ways that are more philosophically coherent and also more in line with ancient, pre-modern, and also Eastern ways of thinking about God. And the upshot of that is that God is not, a thing in the world. God is not Zeus with big biceps, or Thanos who can snap his fingers and make a third of the population disintegrate or whatever. No, God is being itself. God is the source of all being, the ground of all being. God is being itself, not any single item in the world that you can point to or even think about. God is completely beyond all of our ability to grasp as an object. There is no definition of God. God is beyond all of that. God is being itself. God is the ground of all being. And you might remember that in the last chapter, chapter 3 on being, DBH spent a lot of time early on saying no to something. In other words, arguing against something, engaging in a polemical argument against something, mounting a critique against an opposing view or set of views. So in the last chapter on being, chapter 3, David Bentley Hart is saying, no, this is not how Christians and other practitioners of Eastern and ancient religions thought about God. No, that's not the correct view. And only then did he start saying yes, and not just rejecting a certain view or views, but affirming the view that he wants to advocate. So in other words, he spent a lot of time saying no to something, and then he turned his attention to saying yes to something. He does the same thing here in chapter 4 on consciousness. Now, in both cases, it might be a little frustrating to you that he spends so much time arguing against, because it can be very what's the word, burdensome. It can be very maddening. It can be very frustrating to wade through all of David Bentley Hart's arguments against his interlocutors, which in this case, in the case of chapter 4 on consciousness, are basically, for the most part, what he calls philosophical naturalists or people who espouse a mechanical view of nature. So David Bentley Hart spends probably 2/3 of this chapter arguing against those people, saying no to those people. And that can be some tough sledding to get through. And, I think that that's a critique of this book. It's a legitimate critique of this book. I received that. But what I want to do tonight is basically spend most of the time focusing on David Bentley Hart's yes, not his no, his rejection and arguments against his interlocutors, these philosophical materialists, these naturalists who say that that there is no such thing as mind, or that the mind is some sort of an illusion or an epiphenomenon. No, there is no such thing as mind or consciousness, they say. Rather, the only thing that exists is matter, dead, inert matter. David Bentley Hart spends most of his time arguing against them, and then only about 1/3 of his time putting forth his own view. But what I want to do is sort of reverse that proportion, and I want to spend the vast majority of our time looking at David Bentley Hart's yes, the view that he is espousing, that he's affirming, that he is saying that we should embrace. Okay, so that's kind of like the first part of my introductory comments. I want to spend more time looking at the yes rather than the no. The second thing, though, is that I just want to make sure that everyone understands that, like in the last chapter, chapter 3, David Bentley Hart, the chapter was on being, but of course, David Bentley Hart is saying that God is being, right? Well, this time it's the same. David Bentley Hart is arguing that God is consciousness. And I don't know how that hits you, how that strikes your ears. It can seem a little Eastern, a little New Agey, and a little Buddhist, perhaps. But that's what he's saying in this chapter. And I think it's an astonishing idea, and it's a beautiful mystery. And so that's what I want to spend time looking at. Not so much David Bentley Hart's no, but his yes. Not that he's not saying, I don't want to focus on his refutations of consciousness, of people who deny consciousness. Rather, I want to spend most of my time on David Bentley Hart's articulation of what it means to say that God is consciousness. Not only that consciousness is real, but that God is consciousness. Okay, so really what I want to do from here on out is to really, I want to do 3 things. I want to read a paragraph on page 228. Then I want to talk about a little topic. And then I want to conclude with the last 2 pages of the chapter. And I think that if we can do those things, we will have spent our time really, really wisely. All right. So, and again, all of this is about David Bentley Hart's affirmation, not his rejection, but his affirmation, his positive account of what consciousness is, and how at the end of the day, we can say that God is consciousness. Okay. So I'm going to turn to page 228 in the book. And I'm going to read this last incomplete paragraph on 228 that spills over onto page 229. It begins with the words, "when one looks inward," okay? Quote, "When one looks inward, moreover, toward that vanishing point of unity that makes the whole of mental life possible." So in other words, David Bentley Hart is talking about self-consciousness, right? We can talk about consciousness as an awareness of other objects. That is what consciousness is. That's what most philosophers regard as consciousness. So if I'm focusing on this cup, if I'm looking at this cup, I'm conscious of the cup, right? So consciousness sort of assumes an object of our attention. Well, David Bentley Hart is not talking so much about consciousness here. He's talking about self-consciousness, looking inward to that vanishing point of unity that makes the whole of mental life possible. Perhaps one looks towards something more real still. Contemplative and philosophical traditions, Eastern and Western, can insist on this, that the source and ground of the mind's unity is the transcendent reality of unity as such, the simplicity of God. So y'all, that's hearkening back to the previous material on God as being. When he talks about the simplicity of God, just by way of a little bit of review, that's this notion that God does not change. God does not consist of parts and wholes, WHOLES. God is not spatially extended. God is not, what else? God is not dependent on things. I'm forgetting two of them. God does not change. God does not consist of parts and wholes. God is not multiple, and God is not spatially extended. And there's still one that I'm forgetting, but all of that is the doctrine of divine simplicity, that God is none of those things. Instead, God is radically simple. Okay, God is unlike any object in the world. So God is unlike this paperclip, right? This paperclip is spatially extended. It consists of parts and wholes. It changes over time and all sorts of things like that. God is, none of those things pertain to God. God does not change. God is not spatially extended. God does not consist of parts and wholes. All right. So that's the simplicity of God. And so what David Bentley Hart is trying to suggest here is that there's some kind of connection between the simplicity of God on the one hand and some kind of simplicity of our consciousness on the inside of us, okay? Contemplative and philosophical traditions, Eastern and Western, insist on this, that the source and ground of the mind's unity is the transcendent reality of unity as such, the simplicity of God, the one ground of both consciousness and being. So you see, being is related to consciousness. For Plotinus, the oneness of nous, N-O-U-S, that's the Greek word for mind. For Plotinus, the oneness of nous, the intellectual apex of the self, is a participation in the one, the divine origin of all things, and the ground of the openness of mind and world one to another. In other words, for Plotinus, God, aka the one, is what allows our mind and the world to be open to one another. Okay, so for Plotinus, God / nous / the one is what allows us to understand the world and for ourselves actually to be in the world and part of the world. So there's like a transparency and openness between mind and external world. Plotinus says it's God that makes that possible. For Sufi thought, God is the self of all selves, the one, al-Ahad, who is the sole true I underlying the consciousness of everything, of every dependent me. So for Sufi, the Sufi tradition, God is the self, the ultimate self, underlying the consciousness of every dependent me. So if I have a consciousness of myself, the Sufis would say that God underlies that God is deep within me, making my experience of myself possible. According to the Kena Upanishad, Brahman is not that which the mind knows like an object. That's kind of like what we just got done saying, or the eye, or that the eye sees or the ear hears, but is that by which the mind, comprehends, by which the eye sees. So God is not an object that the eye sees. God is that by which the eye can see anything at all, kind of like light or the sun. By which the ear hears. Atman, the self in its divine depth, is the eye of the eye, the ear of the ear, the ground of all knowing. So you may have heard of the Hindu saying, Brahman is Atman, or Atman is Brahman. That means that the self of Matt Bolter is the divine self of God, and the divine self of God is the self of Matt Bolter. Augustine, on looking inward, found a light within that flowed not from himself, but from above, creating and sustaining him, illuminating his mind and calling his mind to itself. According to Moses de Leon, to turn the eye of the mind inward is to find that in their inner essences, all things are a chain caught in the oneness of the indivisible being and knowledge of God. For the Rhineland mystics, people like the author of The Cloud of Unknowing, for the Rhineland mystics, as for the contemplatives of all the great theistic traditions, really, more inward to consciousness than consciousness itself is that scintilla or spark of divine light that imparts life and truth to the soul, and the mind's interior journey toward its well springs that bring it to a place where it finds itself utterly dependent upon the sublime simplicity of God's knowledge of all things in God's knowledge of himself. This is not, however, a contemplative teaching only. So I hope that you're getting something from this. What David Bentley Hart is saying is that God is in me, and that's either what consciousness is, or it's the ground of my consciousness. Kind of like God is the ground of being, so also here, God is the ground of my consciousness. All right. What I want to do next is look at some material on page 232. And I want to read a quote that I have in my notes here. I'll pull it up. I'll try to share my screen and pull it up. I'm hoping you can see my screen now. I'm going to pull up my notes of DBH. Let's see here. I'm going to try to make it super big. Sometimes on YouTube, when these get posted to YouTube, they're sort of hard to see, especially if you're using your phone. So right here, no scientist imagines that at the probably unattainable end of the mind's journey toward full understanding, reality will turn out to be essentially irrational. Okay, pause. What David Bentley Hart is talking about here is how human beings have a desire to know. A desire to know. A desire to understand. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but it's absolutely true. I mean, a desire to understand is what gets people out of bed in the morning. I want to understand how to be a good husband. I want to understand what the meaning of life is. I want to understand how to have a healthy body. I want to understand how to raise good children. I want to understand if God is real. I want to understand how I can be happy, right? How I can serve my neighbor. So David Bentley Hart here is talking about the human desire to understand, and how, so I don't know if you've ever thought about that. Have you ever thought about how, yes, human beings are rational, we have rational minds, but underneath our reason is a kind of desire. We wouldn't even think, we wouldn't even ask questions. We would never pick up a book. We wouldn't even focus on objects, right? I wouldn't even, every time I look at this pen or look at my MacBook or, scratch my cheek, there's an underlying desire that motivates that action. Okay. But the thing is that human desire to understand isn't limited to small stuff like, oh, I need a pen. I need to click the pen so I can write. That is motivated by a desire, but the human desire to understand is not limited to small stuff like a pen. It actually is inexhaustible, and it strives toward what he calls full understanding, right? We want to understand everything. He talks about how Actually, I'm going to pull up my Twitter because I put some stuff on Twitter today, and I'm forgetting the quote I'm looking for. Let's see here. All right. Near the end of chapter 4, David Bentley Hart drops 2 truth bombs which inspire my soul. One is that nihilism is the second best option. Yes. 2, ultimate bliss is the fulfillment of rational desire. But that rational desire, this is what I want to say to you right now, that rational desire is impossibly extravagant. In other words, we want to know everything. Like the rational journey of the human mind to understand reality is comprehensive. It wants to understand everything. It's not like I'm content just to understand a book or just to understand algebra. At the end of the day, we want to understand God. We want to know God. The human desire to understand reality is limitless. Okay. So he continues, we know that reality must be intelligible. We know that matter is mental. That is, it is perfectly rational to accord a certain causal reality of mind over matter in our picture of reality. So David Bentley Hart is espousing a view of consciousness that says that it's prior to material reality. I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase mind over matter, but that's kind of what David Bentley Hart is talking about here. He's saying that it's not the case that the human mind or mind in general, divine mind, sort of stands on the same level as matter or material, the material world. No, he's saying that there's a priority of mind over matter. The only reason we can understand the world is because the world is intelligible. It's able to be understood. In other words, there's a priority on our minds. Okay. So I think that that's really cool stuff. Y'all, we might finish a bit early tonight. I think what I want to do is read the last 2 pages, beginning on page 235. Beginning at the very bottom of page 235, he says this. I suggested above that in many classical metaphysical traditions, the concept of being is one of power. Now, David Bentley Hart here is not talking about like a power play or like coercion or the power of one person to oppress another person. No, he's not talking about that. He's talking about the ability to act. Okay. I suggested above that in many classical metaphysical traditions, the concept of being is one of power, the power of actuality, the capacity to affect or to be affected. To be is to act. Now, I want to pause right there and just sort of give you an example. So when David Bentley Hart is saying that being is the ability to act, think about it like think about an acorn and an oak tree. What is an acorn? Well, it's a potential oak tree, right? Like the purpose of an acorn is to become an oak tree. So if so in this way of thinking, the oak tree is the fulfillment of the acorn. The oak tree is the actualization of the acorn. You could put it like this. The acorn is almost totally potential, but the oak tree is not potential, it's actual. It has already achieved and fulfilled the goal of the acorn, right? So that's complete actuality. You could say that the full oak tree with big branches and strong roots that provides shade, that does photosynthesis really well, that allows birds to come and make nests in the branches, that oak tree is fully actualized. That oak tree is full being compared to that acorn. Now, that's just an analogy. The reason why the acorn is not full being is because it's potential. It's full of potential. That's a good thing, but the oak tree is the fulfillment of the potential of the acorn. So the oak tree, to this way of thinking, has more being. It's more real. It's more actualized. Okay, that's what he means by the power to act. This definition already implies that in its fullness, being must also be consciousness. Wow. So not only is David Bentley Hart saying that God is being and God is consciousness, he's saying that being is consciousness. Because the highest power to act, and hence the most unconditioned and unconstrained reality of being, is rational mind. I'd love to know your thoughts about that, what you think about that. I can tell you that this is very, very connected to stuff that Aristotle says in both the Nicomachean Ethics and the Metaphysics, where he says that the highest activity of the human being is contemplation. Think about what a Buddhist monk is doing whenever they are fully present in the present moment. They're not distracted by the past, worried about the future. They're grounded in the now. That is the kind of thing that Aristotle has in mind, in my opinion, when he talks about contemplation. And he says that that's the highest activity for the human being. And that's connected to what David Bentley Hart is saying here on page 238, when he says that the highest power to act is rational mind. Absolute being, therefore, must be absolute mind. Or, in simpler terms, the greater the degree of something's actuality, like the oak tree, the greater the degree of its consciousness. And so infinite actuality is necessarily infinite consciousness. That, at least, is one way of trying to describe another essential logical intuition that recurs in various forms throughout the great theistic metaphysical systems. It is the conviction that in God lies at once the deepest truth of mind and the most universal truth of existence, and that for this reason, the world can truly be known by us. Whatever else one might call this vision of things, it is most certainly, in a very real sense, a kind of total rationalism. Belief in God, properly understood, allows one to see all that exists, both in its own being and in our knowledge of it, as rational. It may be possible to believe in the materialist view of reality, I suppose, and in some kind of mechanical account of consciousness, but it is a belief that precludes any final trust in the power of reason to reflect the objective truths of nature. I happen to think that a coherent materialist model of mind is an impossibility. I also think that the mechanistic picture of nature is self-evidently false. Nothing more than an intellectual adherence to a limited empirical method that has been ineptly mistaken for a complete metaphysical description of reality. So David Bentley Hart there is calling modern folks to task for taking the really legitimate methods of modern science and inappropriately applying those methods to all of reality. That doesn't work. The only reason modern science is so powerful is because it limits its scope to the observable, to the verifiable, to the repeatable. You can't take that method and apply it to all of reality. And that's what David Bentley Hart is taking certain people to task for doing. I also think that the mechanistic picture of nature is self-evidently false, nothing more than an intellectual adherence to a limited empirical method that has been ineptly mistaken for a complete metaphysical description of reality. I believe that nature is rational, that it possesses inherent meaning, that it even exhibits genuine, formal, and final causes. Yeah. I'm tempted to talk about formal and final causes. Aristotle has 4 causes: efficient cause, material cause, formal cause, and final cause. And basically in the Enlightenment, people wanted to say that those last 2 causes, the formal and the final, are bunk and need to be gotten rid of. And so we're only going to think, modern thinkers began to say, we're only going to think in terms of efficient causality and material causality. And actually, a lot of them just say we're going to stick to only efficient causality, which is like billiard balls, like a cue ball bumping into the 8 ball. That is an example of efficient causality. So the point is that modern thinkers, including modern science, they don't want to think about formal cause or final cause. Final cause is purpose. And David Bentley Hart would agree that that's well and good when it comes to modern science, natural science. It's just that that's not a complete picture of all of reality. And it's certainly not a legitimate move for philosophers or theologians to make. I believe that nature is rational, that it possesses inherent meaning, that it even exhibits genuine formal and final causes, and that therefore it can be faithfully mirrored in the intentional, abstractive, formal, and final activity of rational consciousness. If I am wrong about all these things, however, I think it is also clear that what lies outside such beliefs is not some alternative rationalism, some other and more rigorous style of logic, some better way of grasping the truth of things, but only an abandonment of firm belief in any kind of reasoning at all. I love that line, y'all, because what David Bentley Hart is doing is he's admitting that if it's not the case that our consciousness is able to penetrate into nature, if it's not the case that mind and nature, mind and matter are interpenetrable, if that's not the case, and that is what the naturalists and the people who believe that nature is merely mechanical, that is what they say. And if David Bentley Hart is saying is that if they're right, then we should give up on all reasoning at all. In other words, either mind is real, consciousness is real, we are self-aware, we are aware of nature, we are able to understand the world, or there's no such thing as rationality at all. There's no such thing as beauty, there's no such thing as mathematics, there's no such thing as logic. We should all just be absurdists. God explains the existence of the universe despite its ontological contingency. You'll remember that in the last chapter, talking about God as being, David Bentley Hart was arguing that God is necessary being upon which all else depends. The world and material reality is contingent being, but God is necessary being. So God explains the existence of the universe despite its ontological contingency, which is something that no form of naturalism can do. But God also, and so that's talking about the last chapter, but God also explains the transparency of the universe to consciousness, despite its apparent difference from consciousness, as well as the coincidence between reason and reality and the intentional power of the mind, and the reality of truth as a dimension of existence that is at once objective and subjective. So that's talking about this chapter, right? So he's making an analogy between the last chapter on being and the current chapter on consciousness. Here, just as in the realm of ontology, being, atheism is simply another name for radical absurdism, which again may be a perfectly correct view of things, if reason is just a physiological accident after all, and logic an illusion. That is an argument I shall not visit just now, however. Y'all, you might remember that I think it was in our last discussion on being, chapter 3, and maybe even before that as well, I talked about how there have been times when I've walked into a bar and someone found out that I'm a priest, maybe I'm wearing my collar, and they'll look at me after, a few minutes, maybe after a beer or two, and they'll say, I don't believe in God. And one of the things that I've done, hopefully humbly, hopefully with love, I mean, these conversations usually turn out really well. They're fun. They're very interesting to me and to the other person. But sometimes when people look at me and say, I don't believe in God, I sort of ask them, let me ask you this, friend. Would you be willing to deny the existence of being? I hear you saying that you deny the existence of God. Okay. Are you willing to deny the existence of being? And then I just sit there and listen, because that's obviously a contradiction. You can't deny that existence exists. But but God is being. So if you're not going to deny the existence of being, it necessarily follows that you don't deny the existence of God. But they don't really understand that, because people are not accustomed to, people just don't know that classical Christianity says that God is being. And in the same, so in other words, it's, if you admit that God is being, you realize it's impossible to deny the existence of God. Well, in the same way, something similar is true if God is consciousness, right? Because how can you deny that consciousness exists? The very act of denying something presupposes consciousness, right? So it's very similar. There's a connection between being on the one hand and consciousness on another. And that's what David Bentley Hart is saying in the last few pages of this chapter. Instead, I shall simply observe that if reason's primordial orientation is indeed toward total intelligibility and perfect truth, we talked about that a few minutes ago, if that's the case, then it is essentially a kind of ecstasy of the mind toward an end beyond the limits of nature, right? So David Bentley Hart is saying that the human mind has a desire even to transcend nature, to go beyond nature, which is necessarily limited, right? So we say that God is infinite, meaning that God is not finite, but nature is finite. It has limits. It is an impossibly extravagant appetite, a longing that can be sated only by a fullness that can never be reached in the world. In other words, our desires outstrip this world. I'm reminded of a song that was popular like in the early 2000s by a band named Switchfoot, I think, called We Were Meant to be some, I can't remember it. Something like we were meant for so much more. We were meant to live for so much more. That's how the song goes. That's what David Bentley Hart is saying. We long for more than this world has to offer. So our longing to know and to understand is a longing that can be sated only by a fullness that can never be reached in this world, but that ceaselessly opens up the world to consciousness. To speak of God, however, as infinite consciousness, which is identical to infinite being, is to say that in him, in God, the ecstasy of mind is also the perfect satiety, S-A-T-I-E-T-Y. That the ecstasy of mind is also the perfect satiety of achieved knowledge of perfect wisdom. God is both the knower and the known, infinite intelligence and infinite intelligibility. That is to say that in God, rational appetite is perfectly fulfilled and consciousness perfectly possesses the end that it desires. And this, of course, David Bentley Hart says, is perfect bliss. Y'all, there's so much more that we could talk about, but I really kind of wanted to skip past all of the negations, the arguments that David Bentley Hart is putting forth against these philosophical naturalists who deny the existence of mind, who deny the existence of consciousness. And I wanted to sort of set before us a vision of the mystery of consciousness. What he's saying is that deep down inside of me is God. See, God is both being and consciousness. And if that's true, then when I know something, when I know being, when I know this cup, when Matt knows the cup, God is knowing God. That's basically what David Bentley Hart is saying. Now, that sounds a little scandalous, because I'm certainly not saying that God is identical to the cup, or even that God is identical to me, but God is deep down inside of me, right? That's the scintilla, the spark that I talked about earlier on page 232, I think. Y'all, thank you so much. It's good to be with you tonight. Peace and be well. Bye.